Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our session on an exciting new resource that we are happy to share with you all, Assembly for Peace, a digital handbook on the UN General Assembly's past practice on peace and security, prepared by the United Nations University Center for Policy Research for the President of the General Assembly. I'm Ariel Leibowitz, an Outreach and Communications Librarian from the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library in New York, and your moderator today. I am pleased to welcome you all to our session, which appropriately falls right after the anniversary of the end of the war to end all wars. More than 100 years later, we are still working towards that end. As the President of the General Assembly said in his preface to the handbook, without peace, humanity cannot achieve any of its other aspirations. He then raises important questions that the whole world is asking in the midst of increasing conflict and turmoil. What more can be done at the United Nations? What powers and functions does the General Assembly, as the most universally representative principal organ of the organization, have at its disposal to fulfill this mandate? Before we delve into these questions with Erica Gaston, a few housekeeping items. Please note that this event is being recorded. It is also governed by the UN Code of Conduct, and by joining this event, you are agreeing to abide by this code. Today's session will be offered in English, and we apologize that the platform does not allow for automatic translation. We invite you to turn on captions if your platform allows for it. We have reserved time for discussion following the presentation, and so please post your questions into the chat and we will be collecting them for the latter portion of the session. And with that, I would like to invite Megs Wacha, the Scholarly Communications Officer of the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library, to highlight some of the products and services of the UN Library.
Welcome, colleagues, friends, all. We are honored to have Dr. Erica Gaston here today to discuss the newly published handbook from the UN University Center for Policy Research. As directed by a General Assembly resolution, this handbook details past practices, data, and recommendations for the fulfillment of the functions and powers of the General Assembly as outlined in Chapter 4 of the UN Charter. It is a resource designed to inform member states, entities throughout the UN system, and the wider global public about the General Assembly's actions since the founding of the organization, to provide accurate, impartial, comprehensive, balanced, timely, and accessible information to the public. You'll hear me say these words a few times. This mandate to provide accurate, impartial, comprehensive, balanced, timely information, and to do so in a manner that is accessible to the public, reflects an ongoing commitment on the part of the organization to ensure that member states have the information they require to conduct their work and to make the work of the organization transparent to a global citizenry. This is also the work of libraries, and of this one. Located at UN headquarters, the Dag Hammarskjöld Library is the flagship library of the United Nations. It is part parliamentary library, corporate library, and research library. The planning of a library at UN headquarters began with the planning of the organization itself. In a 1945 report, the UN Preparatory Commission stated that the Department of Conference Services would include a library with research and reference facilities. And in 1946, the General Assembly recognized the central role a library plays as a vital tool for delegations and for the Secretariat in the execution of their tasks. The following year, the library expanded its user base, arranging for the distribution of UN documents and publications to users around the world through a network of depository libraries that received these print copies and made them accessible to researchers and the public for free. The program still exists today and includes 349 libraries in 135 countries and 1 territory. The Dag Hammarskjöld Library then and now connects member state delegations, UN staff, researchers, and global citizens with UN knowledge. Every day, people seek information through the library's resources, at its reference desk, and through its online chat services. They ask questions about how member states voted on recent resolutions, how to access texts such as the Uniting for Peace resolution. They ask about violations of the UN Charter and about specifics of the organization. For instance, they ask the question, does the UN have an army? The library receives questions, sometimes sourced from myths and disinformation, and has the challenging task of identifying the latest hallucinations from generative AI tools such as ChatGPT. These questions are answered through the expertise of our librarians who navigate the authoritative collections of the library to provide, again, accurate, impartial, comprehensive, balanced, and timely information. The library's collections include information resources produced outside of the UN, books, journals, and subscriptions to electronic databases that are relevant for clients working in substantive areas of the UN, international peace and security, economic, social, and sustainable development, human rights, humanitarian relief, international law, and of course, the UN as a subject itself. The library is also charged with providing preservation and long-term access to the intellectual memory of the organization, its official documents and publications. In this regard, the UN Digital Library, a continuously evolving, freely available online repository developed by the Dag Hammarskjöld Library, has become a major reference source for UN staff and delegates. It is a mechanism for people all over the world to access and freely download the organization's written outputs, to connect with the work of the organization through verifiable information produced by the organization. In 2023, our system recorded over 60 million downloads from over 10,000 cities worldwide, and our users continue to grow. It is a site where people come to read resolutions from the Security Council and General Assembly, policy briefs, working papers, as well as documents such as the voluntary national reviews, in which member states assess and present national progress made in implementing the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. I will also note that the publication celebrated today cites multiple items made accessible through the UN Digital Library, and it is made accessible through the digital library itself. More documents are made available each day thanks to library colleagues in our digitization and preservation unit, who digitize the historic documents of the organization held in the basements below the library's reading room. The textual landscape of the United Nations is complicated, with terms defined by official administrative instructions and understanding of those terms sometimes shifting over time. The library's metadata specialists develop and describe the content using authoritative taxonomies, such as the UNBUS thesaurus and the SDG taxonomy, which allow users to surface the documents and information most relevant to their information needs. Our colleagues' work establishes standards which have been adopted not just within the UN Digital Library, but across the UN system. They develop data which provides deeper insights into multilateralism, including voting data and the gender distribution of representatives to the Security Council. Accomplishing the work of the United Nations requires accessing the information of the organization. This happens thanks to the work of many dedicated entities and people, journalists and communications professionals, library and information professionals, both in the Secretariat libraries as well as at our depository libraries, and experts who conduct research and make it accessible, accurately, impartially, comprehensively, and timely, such as done through the handbook at the center of today's discussion. Thank you.
The session today is a product of collaboration between the library and United Nations University. As the work for the digital handbook began, UNU colleagues came to the library to consult on research resources for this project. As a librarian, we don't usually get to see the impact of the work we do or how our research is used. And so it is very rewarding for my colleagues who were involved with that research and for the library as a whole to see our role in the development of such important resources. And so with that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our esteemed colleague, Dr. Erica Gaston, the Senior Policy Advisor and Head of the Conflict Prevention and Sustaining Peace Program at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. Prior to joining UNUCPR, we like acronyms at the UN, Dr. Gaston worked for 15 years as a practitioner, lawyer, and conflict analyst, focusing in particular on issues of conflict-related human rights and civilian protection, rule of law development, and security sector reform. and proxy and sub-state conflict dynamics. She has significant field experience in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan, among others. Erica holds a bachelor's degree in international relations with a specialization in international security from Stanford University. She received her Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School and recently completed her doctorate from the University of Cambridge. She has been a recipient of the German Chancellor Fellowship, the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, and served as a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. She also serves as a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are delighted to have her here with us today. And with that, I would now like to turn the floor over to you, Erica.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you also for facilitating this. And I'm glad that you mentioned our, field mission over just around the hall to the library in person to start this research. So I also definitely want to recognize all of the amazing resources that digitally and in person with the Dag Hammarskjöld Library. It was invaluable in producing this resource. So here to talk today about Assembly for Peace. This is our handbook on the General Assembly's past practice on peace and security, which we produced in cooperation and for the Office of the PGA in the last session. What I'm going to try to do today is walk you through, get an overview of the content, give you a sense of some of the key takeaways and findings from the past examples, but also a little bit of a sense of how could we use this today? Why would having this reference material, which it's designed to be, or this resource, why would that be useful in terms of considering matters that are before the General Assembly today? I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction just on UNU CPR for those who aren't familiar and the research process, and then just dive into the chapters. There's so much rich material in here, we may not get through all of it, but at least it should give you a sense of the sort of content that we have in this handbook. So just to give you some background, a lot of people aren't as familiar with United Nations University, which is one of the UN agencies within the overall UN system. And it works by having a number of institutes globally around the world. So UNU CPR is one of 13 institutes that are located in 12 countries around the world. Many are housed within academic institutions. This is in line with the mission for UN University to be a bit of a bridge between academia and the UN system. UNU Center for Policy Research here in New York is set up a little bit differently. It was designed to be much more action-oriented and linked in with the policies of the UN entities here in New York, almost like a UN-facing think tank. So we work with different parts of the Secretariat, other UN agencies, member states, institutions like the General Assembly, supporting their research or other policy convenings or dialogues on a range of matters. Just to give you a little bit of background on how this handbook came about, the starting point was not us. The starting point for this was the General Assembly. So for many, many years, there's been a revitalization agenda within the General Assembly to further enhance its role, authority, and effectiveness. And particularly within that, an intent to explore what are the different roles, functions, or authorities of the General Assembly, and how do you strengthen things like accountability or institutional memory within the General Assembly so that it works better, works more effectively. And specific to that, in September 2023, there was a resolution within this general revitalization agenda that really identified a need to work more to foster interaction between the Security Council and the General Assembly. The background context of this is that there's been a lot of concerns in the last few years that divisions within the Security Council have limited action on certain matters. And so increasing interest in seeing, does a more revitalized General Assembly mean an ability to aid more in whether it's resolving disputes or taking up matters that perhaps the Security Council is unable to reach a resolution on? So there was this strong desire to look at those synergies between the Security Council and the GA. Also in the resolution was a way to give member states more practical information, an institutional memory. Many member states who bring representatives here, they may or may not have a lot of background knowledge about the UN or institutional, memory of what went on in response to past incidents. And so specifically, there was a call in that resolution for the President of the General Assembly to support a digital handbook on past practices, really outlining how those past practices are grounded within the General Assembly's charter-based authority and how they address some of these issues, like the synergies between the Security Council and GA. Support was then provided by a number of member states that were channeled through the Office of the President of General Assembly. But because they did want it to be a sort of independent reference material, they turned to UNU CPR to execute on it. In terms of the research process and timeline, the overall takeaway from this is that it was very quick, because unfortunately, between the resolution and actually having a contract, there were many deliberations about what kind of handbook. So we really only got started in it, towards the later part of April, and it had to be finished before the end of the session. So it was a very short research and drafting process. We got a lot of guidance and support from different member states involved, not only those that provided financial support, but those in the revitalization committee, but also the president of the General Assembly's office, and really giving a sense of outlining what they were looking for. And that was very strong guidance that it should be grounded in the charter and past practice, that it should be descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's a reference material, something that member states can turn to, not a policy analysis report and not an academic theorization. That we really wanted to look in each of the chapters at what were some of the synergies or what were the relationships or dynamics between the Security Council and the General Assembly on these different peace and security matters, that it should be user-friendly, digital, and interactive. And then finally, it should be as comprehensive as possible, but still digestible. So unlike perhaps some reference materials or things that might have come out of, for example, a more legally oriented office within the UN, they really wanted this to be something that a member state that maybe doesn't have knowledge could quickly look up, understand, even if, their first language is in English and they're not into the legal jargon in English or the UN operational language, they can quickly understand what happened in that particular instance and what does that tell me about the scope for GA action. So that was really the emphasis on it. We did have 2 rounds of kind of peer review from both outside experts, academics, those within the Secretariat, member states, those within the President of the General Assembly's office. We also, because we did have to produce this quite quickly, but it's important for a reference material like this to have obviously accurate information, had kind of 2 rounds of independent fact checking. So people who had worked on developing an initial case were then, a completely separate team would be involved in going back through all of the original sources and fact checking everything through it. So that was the way we tried to balance having that, despite having a very, very quick timeline for turnaround on this. Overview of what you would find if you opened the handbook. To start with, there's just a brief overview of the charter-based authorities, whether that is interpretations of those authorities from key ICJ cases to looking at some recent procedural developments like the Uniting for Peace or the Veto Initiative, even more. Then there's 5 kind of key thematic areas where we discuss practice in those. That's peace operations, use of force, sanctions, accountability mechanisms, and good offices. And I'm going to give some examples from each of those. Important to note for each of these that as part of the digital interactivity, we would summarize, for example, in each of the practice sections, what's the overall practice, what are key takeaways, but embedded throughout the text are hyperlinks that go to an annex that you can read more about particular cases. And that's for member states that maybe really want to dive in, particularly to find out, okay, what happened in the Suez crisis? What were some of the use of force recommendations related to that? As they're reading the practice summary from the use of force, they can simply click on that and it will take them to that case study within the annex. So there's a range of annexes, each with different numbers of cases. Biggest one is the one on accountability mechanisms, and that's because it includes both different types of fact-finding missions and other investigatory bodies, as well as select case studies on some of the referrals to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. There's also an annex on the Veto Initiative, which I'll speak about in just a moment, and also one providing a summary of each of the cases where Uniting for Peace has been raised. So each of the emergency special sessions, as well as one of the regular sessions where UFP was invoked and the original case that sparked the Uniting for Peace, which was the Korean context. So that's an overview of what you would find if you opened it up and how to use it as a manual. It's designed not to be read all in one piece, but to simply be able to go to whichever section is most interesting to you, relevant for whatever issue or historical memory you're looking for. In terms of what those charter-based authorities are, just to switch a little bit into the content, I won't get into this in too much detail. You can always switch to the handbook, but we grounded in looking at Articles 10, 11, and 14, really providing broad authority for the GA to discuss any matters related that are in the scope of the present charter, and specifically relating to the maintenance of international peace and security. And those charter-based authorities also specifically calling out the General Assembly's roles to make recommendations regarding these matters to the states concerned or to the Security Council, and almost creating a built-in accountability mechanism for the GA, particularly to call to the attention of the Security Council to situations that are likely to endanger peace and security. And so because of this, there's been a couple of ICJ cases that have really taken away that although the UN Charter grants primary authority to the Security Council in matters of peace and security, it's primary, not exclusive. The General Assembly also is to be concerned with international peace and security. Also important in that are some thinking about some of the GA's other powers and functions, whether that's its budgetary authority, Article 13, which gives it an additional responsibility on realization of human rights, which come into play in a lot of peace and security situations, and also a super interesting provision in terms of how the GA actually engages on peace and security, and that's Article 22, which empowers the GA to establish subsidiary organs as necessary for its functions. And as we'll see in some of the case examples, that's what enables it to sometimes take actions in peace and security matters, to establish a peace operation, to establish a fact-finding commission or things like that. So that's the core basis. There are limitations, and we have to be mindful of those as well. So Article 11.2 demands that the GA refer this to the Security Council action which is necessary. And that's really reinforcing that GA resolutions are not binding. They don't have coercive or mandatory authority. And so if mandatory or coercive action is needed, that should be referred to the Security Council. Article 12 is also a really interesting provision, and it comes up a lot in these debates. It says that, the GA should basically not make a recommendation where the Security Council is already seized with the matter. And so in early practice, we would see the Security Council, when it sort of had reached a deadlock and wasn't able to take further action, deliberately taking the issue off of its agenda to sort of pass it on to the General Assembly. So there's a couple of cases of that in the handbook. So there are certain limitations on the General Assembly's functions. And so it's important to highlight Article 12 because there really has been some important developments on that. Article 12, as I said, was saying initial practice was that the GA can take up matters only when the SC is no longer seized with them. That's evolved. There's been some really strong ICJ language and cases on this to where it's now considered accepted practice or standard for the Security Council and the GA to take up matters in parallel. So that's important because on a lot of the issues we'll be talking about, the Security Council is still seized with them. And we see examples of that. It's more the norm that both are considering these issues in parallel than that it's only considering one or the other. So that's the background on the sort of charter-based. We also, as I mentioned, get into some of the procedural developments. So it's important to note because sometimes attention can get focused, for example, on the Uniting for Peace, which I'll give a bit of background on. But a lot of the discussions of the General Assembly on peace and security matters, they take part in regular sessions, they take part in the special sessions. They're not only limited to these special mechanisms. Nonetheless, the Uniting for Peace is one of the most prominent procedural vehicles where we've seen the GA engaging on peace and security matters, so it's important to highlight. It emerged in 1950 after divisions over the Korean conflict and the Security Council really unable to act. And the idea was it was introduced as a resolution And where there is a situation where there's a threat to peace and active aggression, and the Security Council, because of divisions between its permanent members, is unable to take up its peace and security responsibilities, the GA can then take up the matter in an emergency special session. It needs a vote. It's not an automatic process that happens whenever, for example, there's a veto on a peace and security matter. But with the vote of 9 Security Council members in the current configuration, or a majority of the General Assembly, one of these emergency special sessions can be convened within 24 hours, so quite rapid. That's the intent of it. There have been 11 emergency special sessions so far, and also one regular session where the UFP resolution was exercised, but there was already a regular session that was on the topic, so that was used in lieu of creating a separate ESS. And also important to note that they can be adjourned and reconvened. So the 10th and the 11th, the 10th related to issues in Palestine and Israel, and the 11th related to Ukraine, are still ongoing and active sessions that can be reconvened at the request of member states. Another important initiative that's more recent is the veto initiative, which was introduced in April 2022. And this was an idea to try to provide a bit of an accountability for vetoes in the Security Council, so that there would at least be a measure of General Assembly debate on them. So this holds that whenever one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council puts forward a veto, when a veto is cast, that the GA will meet within 10 working days and hold a debate on the issue. If they're already going into an emergency special session, which has already happened twice, then they don't need to go to this immediate veto initiative debate. But already, partly because we've seen a more active terrain for vetoes in the last 2 years than in some time, there have been a number of debates triggered. So far, there's been 10 debates in the GA. So far, in each of these, the debates have not resulted in action, so in a follow-on resolution on the matter. But of course, this is the potential, and many member states debate whether that will be sort of the forward direction of the veto initiative. I'll now turn and just give you a little bit of a sense of some of the key findings from the thematic chapter. And I want to emphasize that I'm going to go through, some of the content, and it's really just to give you an example of the sort of material that you might find there, but also, and this is really important, how it might be relevant to current debates today. I'll try to get through a little bit of each of the 5, but I'm also cognizant of time and leaving time for questions and answers. So we'll just get as far as we can, and it will at least give you a flavor for the report. So peace operations, I'm starting with that because I think it's one of the most interesting examples. I think in a lot of current, memories or understanding of the General Assembly, if you ask somebody who's new to the organization or someone on the street, they would maybe automatically think that's the Security Council that authorizes peace operations. It's not the General Assembly. What we see in this practice is that's definitely not true. The GA has been active in authorizing peace operations almost from from the beginning of its history. And not only has it authorized a number of them, but often quite precedent-setting ones. So in 1956, it was the GA that first authorized the first fully fledged peacekeeping operation, which was UNEF, which was authorized in response to the Suez Crisis. In 1962, they authorized the first UN peace operation to administer a territory. That was in West New Guinea, which is now in Indonesia. In 1993, they authorized the first joint UN peace operation with a regional body. So that was in Haiti and together with the Organization for American States. So the GA has both created these new peace operations, but also quite interestingly, in some cases, it's interacted with and helped extend the functions or mandate of those that were created by the Security Council. So in 1958, there was a standstill in the Security Council over one of the peacekeeping operations in Lebanon. This is UNIGIL. And the GA steps in at that point quite cooperatively. This SC knew this was going on, that this was really a case of synergies, and was able to expand some of the tasks and lend support to UNIGIL so that they could address the situation that had evolved there. In 1960, also, they gave strength to similar issue of a division within the Security Council over the already authorized mission in the Congo. The GA stepped in, provided it with a more robust mandate, and later on would help extend it for an additional 6 months. So there's cases where you see these examples of cooperation between the Security Council and the General Assembly on supporting peace operations as the situation demands. Also interesting to note, not only peace operations, but also humanitarian operations and special political missions, including some of those that have been very prominent in recent peace and security debates. So both UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, and UNSCO, which is the Office for the Middle East, kind of coordination of the Middle East peace process, were both General Assembly mandated peace operations. So super interesting to note now. Last thing I'll just note is that they do a full range of tasks. It's quite interesting to kind of go into some of the case studies and look at this, from monitoring ceasefires to elections and referenda to facilitating, like actively facilitating peace negotiations, as in Guatemala, to monitoring human rights or supporting police functions in DDR. So quite the full span of tasks on that. Key takeaways from that would be, first of all, that there is this really, really strong practice area in the peace operations, even if it hasn't been quite as active in the last 2 decades, and also really strong complementarity and back and forth with the Security Council on this, in terms of the Security Council passing issues related to peace operations to the General Assembly when it couldn't take forward action, but also the inverse, cases where the GA was sort of the starting or leading point of action, and the Security Council later kind of took up that peace operation and extended its mandate. So really strong area of synergies. I want to think about this now on this point of how is this learning about past practice relevant to current debates? And I'll say again, these bits, the little blue box is not in the handbook. And that's because, again, the handbook is designed to be descriptive, but not prescriptive. But I want to give you a sense of why would it matter that we understand these precedents better? How would that be relevant for current discussions or peace and security issues? One, it can help you understanding some of the limits and opportunities of GA-supported bodies. So I mentioned this, I think, a little bit earlier, but because the GA does not have mandatory coercive power, it can't force, a member state to, for example, accept a peace operation. It has to have the consent of the host state. So that's an important framing to keep in mind. A lot of talk recently has been, what is the scope for UN operations in the Israel-Gaza context? Important to think that the kind of 2 key UN bodies there, which are GA mandated, are UNRWA and UNSCO. So what are the limitations of those, but also what are the options? So this is one way that it's helpful to understand past precedent and what the implications are. Another is, how much does this give ideas for member states, ideas for the solutions for going forward or different pathways? There's been a lot of debate recently, for example, on future models of peace operations, maybe ones partnering more with regional organizations, maybe having a wider range of functions. So not doing full multidimensional peace operations, but focusing on particular tasks, or having transnational peace operations, perhaps in countries that aren't particularly taken up in a Security Council mandate. So there's lots of ways to look at this history and imagine, hey, for some of these new models, maybe General Assembly cooperation or support could actually be more appropriate, or could be useful in taking up parts of it in conjunction with the Security Council. So these are ways that this understanding of the past practice can really help with current debates and current learning. Another strong example of this is accountability mechanisms. This is one of the richest and the biggest areas within the GA handbook, partly because there's such an extensive practice within the General Assembly on this. And they range on everything from making statements and determinations on legal violations to introducing and creating, using the Article 22 authorities, fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry, and other investigatory bodies. So a really recent example of this was the creation of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria in 2016, which was super interesting because not only is it a fact-finding mission, but in part because the GA has this slightly greater authority to create sort of quasi-judicial or judicial bodies. It sort of goes a little bit beyond a traditional fact-finding mechanism. It has a sort of pre-prosecutorial function in terms of supporting prosecution. So it's a little bit more of an accountability mechanism with teeth to it. There's also been a lot of cases of referrals to judicial bodies. So the General Assembly can refer cases directly to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. And we do a general overview of those, as well as 9 case studies of those in the handbook. They can't directly refer cases to the ICC, but there's been important cases where they have recommended and tried to give further momentum to doing so. So, example, for the Security Council to do so with the cases of the DPRK and Syria. One important note on these referrals to judicial bodies, we do discuss them in the accountability section. They are important accountability mechanisms, but it's also interesting to see the way that GA action on these accountability mechanisms has often been a way of engaging in peace and security matters, of trying to take steps forward to advance a dispute or to facilitate good offices. See that a lot with the decolonization cases, but also on the status of Kosovo, where they're really trying to bring a sort of legal clarity to bear in a way that might unlock some of the issues that are preventing that dispute from being resolved. So that's quite an interesting part of it. And I will say also, I have throughout this PowerPoint, at least since it's been visible to you, these graphs on the side, those are all taken from the handbook. And it's just, again, to point out there's different summary materials throughout the handbook. Again, all hyperlinking either to the digital library references, to the case studies, or to other outside resources. Another example from the accountability mechanisms of how this could be relevant today. Again, it's important for understanding the ongoing debates. So one of the cases that the General Assembly referred to the ICJ was over Israel policies and practices in East Jerusalem. That decision came out this summer. It's also still a case study in our handbook, and it is something that's an active point of discussion in terms of both within the GA and outside of it. Are there ways to follow up on that case? So looking to what was behind the GA's decision to refer that matter, what happened in the case, can help inform those discussions today. It's also, some of the examples show ways that accountability measures can be a strong option for action, for keeping an item on the agenda or facilitating other action, particularly in cases of Security Council deadlock or inaction. And so we can see that in both in some of the ICJ referrals. So with the cases related to Palestine, but also the recent ICJ referral on climate change, but also see that in kind of putting on, keeping matters on the agenda that maybe aren't getting the attention elsewhere. Some of the decolonization cases, some of the fact-finding missions, or simply statements like the 2021 statement on the situation in Myanmar. And then last, it's important to look at some of these examples because they give ideas for future innovative action. So in the example I mentioned with the IIIM related to Syria, that and its pre-prosecutorial function, it gives an illustration of how in certain cases the GA might have a bit more of a comparative advantage in creating judicial bodies that are leaning more towards actions. Can also look at other examples of the GA-supported accountability mechanisms. So we described several of the FFMs and the commissions of inquiry. Often they were directly involving member states in those commissions rather than having outside experts. And so they were often paired with and used to facilitate other good offices measures at the same time. So quite interesting precedents that could be taken up today. I think I'll just give one more example from the sanctions and then kind of allow space for questions, because I think the sanctions are also quite interesting. So again, also because, reminder, all GA recommendations are not mandatory, not binding. They can't introduce mandatory sanctions. They can only recommend sanctions that the Security Council introduce them or other member states or other actors take sanctioning measures. Nonetheless, the GA has had a really interesting and formative role in shaping modern sanctions practice, from some of the earliest action that helped to develop this practice of how sanctions could help to de-escalate or mitigate violence. So really early cases back to Korea, in Namibia and Southern Africa. Also interesting focus on particular drivers of conflict. So I think the GA was much more early on looking at the effect of mercenaries or other privatized force and how limitations on those might be key to reducing violence in certain conflict contexts in Africa. Also, if you look at the GA's, past practice with regard to apartheid, GA was really a driving force in that, not only in recommending sanctions, but recommending the sort of broad-based sanctions that have been attributed with creating movement on it, but also lots of other convening authority, conferences, follow-up monitoring committees, the things that would actually give some weight to those sanctions. Another interesting early practice, and I come back to this for my last point on things to think about for current practice, the GA was also an early adopter or maybe even an innovator of the current practice of having sanctions committees and panels of experts. So the idea that you need somebody to monitor and follow up on them for these sanctions practices to be effective. The GA has been less active in recommending sanctions or sanctioning measures since the 1980s, but even modern practice, we do see examples of this. So a recent notable one was the 2021 resolution in Myanmar, where they recommended an arms embargo. That, again, in a situation where the Security Council was really deadlocked on the same issue. And also other cases, for example, where there have been transgressions of sovereignty or acts of aggression, as well as gross violations of human rights. Interesting examples from this. I think this sanctions lesson has real potential for current context. So this is one of the areas where I think a lot of people see deadlock within the Security Council limiting responses in certain areas. So the fact that the GA can engage and can encourage sanctioning measures, if not by the by the Security Council, but also by other member states or societal ones, could be something that's a really relevant model in a lot of places where there is Security Council deadlock. The other issue is that an issue within the Security Council recently has been some cases of vetoes of sanctions committees or panel of experts within the Security Council. So the most recent example was in the DPRK, where there were vetoes on the sanctions committee. So there's a sanctions regime for the DPRK, but there's no monitoring mechanism. So here's a very ready example where the General Assembly does have the capacity to support this mechanism and to create, through its Article 22 powers, either sanctions committee or other panels of experts or monitoring and accountability mechanisms. I think just in the service of questions, I'm going to skip through to the end on the rest of them. There's more to dig into good offices. I think there's some really interesting implications there. Use of force was one of the largest practice areas, surprisingly. I put it last because I would need an entire presentation just to get into the use of force recommendations, but really worth digging into on there. The overall takeaway that I'd like to just leave you with, and that the handbook does stand behind, is that first, there is ample charter-based authority to act, for the General Assembly to act on peace and security, further anchored in a really strong repertoire of practice. That where the GA does act on peace and security matters, they have a strong potential to shape the international response, to drive action, especially where the Security Council is unable to act due to deadlock. They have the ability to keep matters on the agenda when action is stalled, and also a really strong complementary accountability role, not displacing, but in complement to what the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, or other actors would be doing. Also, because of their sort of natural role of vested in the charter of providing recommendations to the Security Council, we've often seen cases, whether it's simply in the emergency special sessions, in regular resolutions where they note Security Council's inability to act on certain matters, or in the recent veto initiative of trying to hold the Security Council more to account. And then finally, across all of the practice areas, seeing a lot of examples of synergies between the General Assembly and the Security Council, that, while the GA can act as a check a bit on the Security Council, there's also a lot of places where working together, they can have more productive engagement on resolving disputes and taking action. The one kind of bar that we would see, or sort of missing piece as we went through this, one is just a lack of institutional knowledge. A lot of people are not aware of this practice, have sort of forgotten, that the GA ever did anything on peace operations or sanctions or use of force. So I think, knowledge is really the key in this case for enabling different innovation or for enabling further pathways to be taken forward. particularly in the last 2 decades, I think there's been a tendency to look only to the Security Council for action on peace and security. And so at this difficult time, it can be really important to also look at the General Assembly's role. And then finally, and this is a message I often bring up with member states, is as someone who's had to read at this point, hundreds of these resolutions stretching back to 1947, we observe a tendency over time for them to get longer, but often in recent years more declarative or performative rather than action-oriented. And so I think things like this handbook are important to remember that GA resolutions are not simply a statement on the issue. They have the power to drive action and to drive change. And hopefully this can be a tool that will allow member states to use that going forward.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was a ton of information, and I'm still trying to unpack it all in my head. But I personally really have learned a lot, both from this presentation and from the handbook. One of the things we get asked about a lot, and which we have a very popular AskDAG, which is our FAQ, frequently asked questions platform, is, are UN resolutions binding? And, in our response, we link to various legal interpretations, and we get a lot of responses to our FAQ as to whether it's helpful or not. And so it's really interesting both to read in the handbook and to hear you talking about the roles given to the General Assembly by the Charter. And so I'm wondering if you would be able to talk a little bit more about, or actually even give us advice on how we can respond to people who ask, are these resolutions binding, or why the General Assembly isn't stepping in to do more to prevent conflict?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important, because the short answer of the General Assembly resolutions is that they're not binding. But that short answer can then lead people to think that they then cannot drive action or effects. And what we see is that that's not true, and that's not the impression that we want to leave to. There's legal grounding from it. This in ICJ cases, there's a great in the certain expenses case where they make clear that the General Assembly is not just a place for debate. These are not designed to be a place for only hortatory action, but for actually driving action. But we also see it in the effects. So General Assembly can make general recommendations and statements, but it also can create, as we noted, peace operations, fact-finding missions, deploy a representative who can actually engage in good offices, be the convener of disarmament conferences, be the driving force between establishing zones for peace or non-nuclear weapon-free zones. All of these things that then can be really the Kickstarter or the venue or place for action to happen, and often is what you need in trying to unlock some of these disputes or create a space for other, whether it's member states, UN institutions, what have you, to bring other kind of tools and responses to the table.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I found it really interesting that what you pulled out as one of the key takeaways is the lack of institutional knowledge. And, as a library, institutional knowledge and, the history of what the organization has done is really important. And it's one of the things that we're constantly trying to help solve. So I'm just wondering if you had any trouble accessing the resources necessary for the handbook, like were there some materials that you couldn't find or some materials that were harder to find? Yeah.
Well, first, just again, to say that the digital libraries and the resources were invaluable. And this is why, a lot of what we try and do in the handbook is just provide, in every single case study, you'll see it studded with hyperlinks to these digital library resources so that they can go for further information. And most of it is not hard to find. Some of the things that we tried to make more accessible, for example, might be things like the juridical yearbook, which actually is a really useful source of just understanding the surrounding context, how different member states responded, really just the nitty gritty, but it allows you to understand the weight of past examples in practice. And those, I think, can be, it depends, they're available to varying degrees at different points in time. And then, of course, the juridical yearbook stopped being produced at the same rate at a certain point. So, but they are a heavy source to dive into for sure. And being able to get exactly to where you want in the juridical yearbook that would tell you about that case is not easy. So if we tried to do one thing in terms of accessibility, it was maybe trying to do that legwork of here's some deep history that we've pulled out for you, and here's where you can go, to this page number for greater like understanding of it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, it really does link to an incredible amount of resources and things that we do get asked for regularly. It's, how often has the use of force been endorsed? And so having these tables and having these lists, I think, is an incredible research resource. We do actually have a question from a master's student at the University of Oxford who's writing their dissertation on zone of peace resolutions in the General Assembly. And they said that there was limited literature on this topic and say that the handbook has been helpful so far. But they wondered if you might share further thoughts on these zone of peace resolutions and their impact, if any.
Yeah, it's a super interesting. This is in our, for those who aren't as familiar and want to look up more, this is in our Good Offices chapter practice. And then there's some case studies and material on this. And I think this is a really interesting example where the GA's convening power can create spaces for action. So, the zones of peace were often taken forward by individual member states. Similar also, there's some parallels between the zones of peace and the nuclear weapons free zones, where different regional organizations were also kind of championing them at different points. But really, this being a continuous topic on the GA's agenda over, more than a decade, multiple decades, was important in giving this issue prominence and creating a space for member states who wanted to kind of declare this zone of peace. And often you see these zones of peace emerging among states that might feel that they otherwise don't have the power or standing on their own to demand this, that they feel that there's a power imbalance and that their peace and security is being affected by larger geopolitics. And so this is an interesting example also of the General Assembly kind of putting its whole might behind this and really leveraging the concerns of some of its member states and trying to, at the same time as trying to create a mechanism almost of preventive action of trying to say like, okay, we're keeping this zone out of geopolitics. So yeah, I can appreciate your master's student thesis being devoted to this, because it is a massive topic and one that's underexplored, and who knows, one that also might have relevance going forward as we try to look for new multilateral solutions to face common challenges.
Thank you so much. I think that will be incredibly helpful for their master's research. So in the preface of the handbook, the PGA mentions that it's a digital handbook because they would like it to allow for the flexibility that it can be updated, maintained, expanded. And so I know that it was only launched in September, but are there plans, or will it be updated? Will new editions be published? This is both my question and a question in the chat, so that worked out really well.
Yeah. So because this was a document that came out of a GA initiative, it would be dependent, and it was of that session, so kind of it was born in and also in somewhat with the last session. But if the GA wanted to, through its continuing revitalization agenda, introduce a new resolution that also included space for updating a digital handbook, or perhaps for expanding the topics. So there are definitely other topics that didn't get covered, partly because of time or other issues, then there certainly would be an opportunity to do so. I mean, these resolutions are, devolving sort of every day, every month. So there's always more content to be generated on it.
Absolutely. And just because I have to promote the library resources, we do actually have a number of tools that you can use to check to see if there have been updates. For example, we on our research.un.org, we have a list of the emergency special sessions emanating from the Uniting for Peace resolution. So you can check that really quickly to see if there is a 12th one. And I was also playing around in the digital library to see if you could generate some of the results just through searches. And so, for example, for advisory opinions requested from the ICJ, we actually have a series that is linked to all of the resolutions where that has happened, and where you can generate a list as well. And even with the veto initiative, I'm not 100% sure about this. I'm still talking to my colleagues, but I believe that the use of veto is an agenda item starting in the 77th session. So you should be able to do an agenda search in the digital library that would pull up the meeting records every time that there's a meeting emanating from a veto in the Security Council and that new initiative. So hopefully we can, even if the GA doesn't mandate an update, we can work together to make sure that the digital handbook and the resources in it are continually made available and maintained.
Oh, those sound like valuable tools for sure.
We are about to run out of time, and there are always questions about the permanent 5 and the rationale and why the General Assembly doesn't vote for all members of the Security Council. So this is veering a little away from the handbook, but with the veto initiative and the ongoing talks on institutional reform, do you see the General Assembly taking a greater role or here?
Well, I think one way that it maybe, does kind of tie back to thinking about the lessons from the handbook, one issue that's really live in a lot of discussions in New York is follow up on the Pact for the Future and how to kind of take some of those decisions and commitments forward, one of which was Security Council reform, among others. And, that's not an issue that clearly, for example, the Security Council would take forward. It was signed by all member states. It's much more natural that the General Assembly would take that up. But here, what we would look to is what is the scope of the GA's power, particularly the President of the General Assembly's power to do so? What are their convening powers? What processes are necessary? So it's just another example of how understanding where the GA can do, or take a practice like the Zones for Peace that we brought up, how GA leadership on a large multi-stakeholder, multilateral process can really be significant in pushing forward that agenda. So I think it doesn't directly answer your question, but I think if you look at those analogous processes, that is the way that something like Security Council reform, concern about voting rights, or other institutional reforms could be taken forward by the GA, could have a very strong leadership role. And I think also, just to add to, and this is related more to the veto initiative, and I mentioned this a little bit before. So the veto initiative obviously is designed to be an accountability mechanism to an extent of the Security Council to provide more transparency over vetoes, also maybe a little bit of pressure on restraint from using them. But what could be even more impactful, as I mentioned, so far the debates have not resulted in a follow-on action or resolutions. A way to make that stronger might be where there is a debate on a veto, having a corresponding measure. So, right. One clear example that's come up that was raised by member states in our research process was, if you had, in the case where the DPRK Sanctions Committee was vetoed, right, there was then a debate on that veto. An option would have been to put forward a resolution with the GA supporting a sanctions committee or panel of experts for the DPRK sanctions regime. So that's just one example, but it is a way that you could use those tools that already exist to have a stronger measure of accountability and action coming from the General Assembly.
Unfortunately, we've run up against exactly 11 o'clock. So it's time to wrap up the session, but I just really want to offer my thanks to you, Erica. This was really quite informative and wonderful. And so I want to thank you for joining us today, and I anticipate future collaborations. I feel like there's a lot we can do with UNUCPR, and so I hope we can find more ways to work together. I also want to urge all the people online to spend some time with the handbook. It is really full. There's so much richness there. And I think there's a lot more that can be pulled from it as you use it in your own research. So I want to thank you all for who connected online, for your insightful questions and engagement. And we look forward to welcoming you all at future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.